Hello and welcome to the third lesson on magazines for Component 2. Obviously we're studying Vogue magazine, in particular a specific edition from 1965, and this third session is on media industries to go along with the stuff we did in class on media language and of course representations. So to give you an idea of the learning objectives for this session, we are going to consider the influence of social, cultural and historical and economic context on Vogue magazine. We're going to know the significance of patterns of control in the magazine industry, and then finally take a quick look at some of the issues surrounding regulation within the magazine industry. First of all, though, I think we ought to define exactly what magazines are. That might sound strange, seeing as we've already studied it in some detail, but we haven't really put a definition on what a magazine is from an industry perspective. So here we go. A magazine is a periodical publication containing a collection of articles that are targeted at a particular audience. It communicates its meaning through images and, of course, text. Now, all of this, as you probably realise, sounds awfully a lot like a newspaper. So let's draw some kind of key distinctions. So from a practical perspective, magazines are usually printed on higher quality paper and newspapers tend to use newsprint. Also, practically, magazines are usually stapled or bound, whereas the pages in newspaper are loose. From a content perspective, magazines are not expected to provide readers with a more up-to-date information about maybe even the previous day's news in the same way that newspapers are, as magazines are published less frequently. However, something else that they do have in common is that although both media magazines and newspapers are published in print form traditionally, there has been a significant rise in online magazines in recent years, as the magazine industry has begun to adapt to the different demands of a digital age. And it's important to note here that this isn't the first time that the magazine industry has had to adapt in order to survive. The rise of commercial TV in the 50s and 60s was also seen as a major threat to the magazine industry, as publishers had to compete not only for new audiences, but also for advertisers. So let's jump straight in by looking at social, cultural and historical contexts that had an impact on the magazine industry. As we know, genres are not fixed, they're not static, their codes and conventions can change and evolve over time based on a number of factors, and that includes the influence and changes in wider social and cultural context. And of course, that's true of the magazine industry as it is any media. If we just look at differences between Cosmopolitan here in the 1960s compared to a more recent edition, we can see just how ideologies shift over time. Therefore, to understand a magazine from the 1960s, we need to be aware of how it relates to the context in which it was produced. And so just to recap on some of the issues that we discovered through research and some discussion in the classroom, let's have a look at some of the key contextual issues that had an impact on magazines at the time. First of all, the rise of consumerism during the 50s and 60s. Obviously, during the Second World War, there was a great deal of austerity, and that gave way to a new era of economic prosperity that magazines reflect. Theorist James Curran suggests that having gone through a make, do and mend phase in the 40s, the middle market women's magazines of the 60s were now part of a shop and spend euphoria. That's reflected not only in the image here of basically the fact that we had a lot more stuff in our houses, but through arts and culture. The famous image on the right-hand side being Andy Warhol's take on consumerism in the 1960s with his prints of Campbell's soup tins. One element that we discussed at some length in the classroom was the 1960s being a time of sexual revolution. They were seen by many to herald in a new era of female liberation. One factor in this was the introduction of the contraceptive pill in the early 60s, but there was also legislative changes such as revisions to the Married Women's Properties Act in 1964, which enabled women to gain a greater sense of financial independence and freedom than possible. And then finally, we must consider the 60s as a time of sort of cultural revolution. The swinging 60s, as it was described, saw the emergence of new trends in music and fashion and film. Britain was completely at the heart of this. So let's ask a few questions and apply these ideas to our study of the 1965 edition of Vogue magazine. First of all, from the 1965 set text edition of Vogue, what evidence is there that the magazine was part of a shop and spend culture of 60s consumerism? Secondly, what evidence is there from any of the magazine that it reflects a era of women's liberation? And then thirdly, how is the 1965 copy of Vogue indicative of a time of cultural revolution and cultural experimentation? So look through your whole copy to find examples for this and evidence for it. Don't just look at the cover or the contents page. Look at the articles, the images, the copy, the mode of address, and of course some of the advertisements. But you should also maybe do a little bit of additional research. Find a recent copy of Vogue magazine or visit their website. Evaluate the main differences between the content, style, and representations of the Vogue from the 1960s and Vogue from now. How does today's Vogue reflect the context of 21st century British society? And once you've answered that, just consider this. Despite the differences between the past and the present versions of Vogue, have the ideologies of the magazine changed, or have any of them remained the same? Let's move on and consider some of the economic contexts behind the production of magazines. So when understanding the production of and the success of a magazine, it is important to consider the influence that economic factors have of the product being studied. A key question that we should always ask is, how is the product, in this case the magazine, funded? Now, some magazines are financed entirely through the cover price or through subscribing. However, the vast majority of magazines have dual revenue streams, as they rely on advertising for a significant proportion of their revenue. In some cases, over half of a magazine's total revenue will come from advertising alone. So it's important to bear this in mind, as it means that magazines generally have to attract advertisers as well as readers in order to be commercially successful. This image on the right hand side is from what's known as Vogue's media pack. It's a pack that's sent out to potential advertisers to tell them and show them the prices it will cost to advertise in their publication. As you can see, it's quite a hefty amount to advertise for a single colour page advertisement in Vogue magazine, running into the tens of thousands of pounds, which can show you quite clearly how Vogue makes quite a lot of its money. And it also explains why sometimes publishers will cut the cover prices of their titles or even give away free copies of magazines. The result obviously has a boost in circulation, and if the potential advertisers see a boost in circulation, that's quite appealing for them to advertise in the pages. And this takes us neatly on to the ownership and control over magazines. Curran and Seaton's theory can be related here, and one that we've looked at already, and it can help us understand the significance of patterns of control and ownership within specifically the magazine industry. But just to recap, if you can't quite remember it, here is a very simplified version of Curran and Seaton's arguments. First of all, that the media are controlled by a small number of companies. Primarily, they're driven by the logic of profit and power. And second, this leads to a general trend in media industries towards greater concentration of ownership. Now, this concentration of ownership is often a result of horizontal integration. For example, one of the ways in which some major publishing houses have been able to consolidate their power in the magazine industry is by acquiring or merging with rival publishers. This effectively reduces the competition as it's concentrated in the hands of fewer companies. That's horizontal integration, and it comes with its own set of benefits that we should probably consider here. There are different critical perspectives regarding the consequences of horizontal integration, and one argument that horizontal integration is of a benefit to the magazine industry is that major publishers are much better equipped to cater for a wide range of audiences, as their size and their economic power makes it easier for them to launch new titles as audiences' tastes change and new markets emerge. Rather than limiting creativity, the financial stability they have gives them the freedom to be more innovative. However, those ideas aren't always shared by everyone, and there are some arguments that consider the negative towards horizontal integration, and these are covered by a theory such as Curran and Seaton. They claim that this creates a negative impact on media industries and audiences. Their argument is that media concentration not only limits or inhibits variety, creativity and quality, but also reduces choice for consumers rather than expands it. This is partly because major companies are risk averse. They're constantly looking for ways to minimize costs and maximize profits. For instance, when one publisher buys out another, they may decide to merge or even close some of their titles, particularly the niche titles, rationalizing their resources in order to produce greater economies of scale. Let's have a look at an alternative to this. This is an IPC. This is a big company which is actually a vertically integrated media conglomerate. And so before we look at this, let's remind ourselves of some of the key terms we have looked at before but maybe a little bit rusty on. First of all, this term conglomerate, which is really defines a large organisation that has interests that span across a number of different businesses or industries. For example, the Walt Disney Company is a media and entertainment conglomerate, as it has business interests in several different industries, including film, TV, music and radio, as well, of course, as the theme park industry. So let's relate to the magazine industries. Major companies often attempt to consolidate their power into other sectors of the media rather than just concentrating on one particular area of business. This is called diversification, and obviously large organisations are involved in a variety of different businesses become conglomerates if they diversify. An example of a conglomerate in the magazine industry is the rise of IPC, International Publication Corporation, in 1963. IPC was formed following a merger between the Mirror Group, which owned a large portfolio of newspapers and three of the biggest publishers in the magazine industry, Oddham's Press, George Newnes and Fleetway. Oddham's, which was the original publisher of Women and Women's Realm magazine, had already taken over George Newnes and the Holton Press, two of its main competitors in 1958. The subsequent merger saw IPC establish itself as the largest newspaper and periodical printing group in the world. At the time, IPC owned 9 national newspapers, 78 consumer magazines and comics, and 126 trade and technical journals, and was involved also in book publishing. Another factor that made IPC such a powerful force during the 60s was its ownership of several large-scale, high-speed printing plants. This meant that it could print its titles in high volume and high quality. Woman and Women's Realm were both able to carry a significant number of advertisements, for example. Companies such as IPC that have control over different stages of the production and or distribution process are said to be vertically integrated. Historically, the most powerful publishers have tended to be the ones that are vertically integrated companies. So if we remind ourselves of vertical integration, it is this process whereby one company acquires another, involved at a different level of the industry. So, for example, a vertically integrated business would be a production company that owns a distributor or retailer, or a magazine publisher, as we've mentioned, that owns the printing company. Let's look at an alternate model, and one that's more relevant to our study of Vogue, Condé Nast, and Advanced Publications. So whilst IPC had established control over the weekly women's magazine market in the 60s, other publishers such as the National Magazine Company, whose titles included Good Housekeeping and Harper's Bazaar, and Condé Nast, which publishes Vogue and House and Garden, also remained highly competitive in other sectors of the consumer magazines. Condé Nast was one of the first publishers to launch international editions of its magazines. Whilst Vogue was originally an American publication, a British edition, as we know, of the magazine was launched in 1916, and this was followed by several other international editions, including Vogue Paris and Vogue Italia. These editions were published through Condé Nast's international arm of the company. Unlike IPC, Condé Nast did not own any of its publishing plants in the UK, although it did own a printing company in the USA. However, its long-term contract with the Sun Engraving Company gave it access to some of the highest quality printing presses in the country. Having the means to produce a high-quality colour images was particularly important for Vogue, which, as an upmarket fashion magazine aimed at a niche audience, depended on advertising for much of its revenue. Since 1959, Condé Nast has been owned by the American media company Advanced Publications. Originally a newspaper publisher, Advanced Publications diversified during the 1950s and 60s as it moved into other industries such as magazine publishing and broadcasting, acquiring a number of American TV stations and magazines to add to its growing number of newspaper titles. This process of diversification and horizontal integration helped to establish Advanced Publications as a powerful media conglomerate. So finally, let's look at magazine regulation. As we've seen from our study of the newspaper industry and watching the documentary The Fourth Estate, the regulation of the British press in the 21st century has been a somewhat controversial and problematic area. However, the 2011 Leveson inquiry into cultural practice and ethics in the press was not the first time the practice and the behaviour of the press had been investigated. In fact, due to concerns over potential emergence of monopolies within the print media industries, a royal commission was set up to explore the issue, and a report was published in 1962. Some of the areas discussed in this 62 report are not dissimilar from those raised in the Leveson inquiry of 2011. For example, the Royal Commission was highly critical of the General Council, the body who was responsible for press regulation at the time, citing that it had not been regulating with authority. A lack of lay people who weren't associated with the press, involved in the regulation process was also criticised. The report led to the Press Council replacing the General Council, just as IPSO has now replaced the PCC as a response to the Leveson inquiry in 2011. The report of 1962 also hinted that statutory regulation may be necessary, as it was also discussed after the publication of Leveson. Let's just remind ourselves of what this term means, statutory regulation. It's a system of regulation that's implemented by law, by government. It's often seen as a potential threat to the principles of self-regulation, in which the media industries assume the responsibility for regulating themselves, essentially. The same argument often raises concerns around the issues of free speech and, of course, propaganda. So currently, the press regulation is monitored by IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organisation. So despite these similarities, there's some difference in terms of how the magazines are regulated now compared to the 1960s. And so to give you an idea of what IPSO does and how it's meant to operate, just watch the video that IPSO produced to understand the current regulatory process.